be able to read the minds of others, to know the minds of others. And so the Buddha says that even if one doesn't have the ability to know the minds of others, that is not so important. What he says is important is to be able to know one's own mind. And he uses the simile of a young person, a man or a woman, who is fond of ornaments, and so they like to dress up in fancy clothes and to put on ornaments, and then they look at the reflection of their own face in a mirror. I guess in those days mirrors were not so common, so he says, in a clear bowl of water. And so when you look in a clear bowl of water or in a mirror, you can see the reflection of your face exactly as it is. And so the task, or one of the tasks for us in practicing the Buddha's Dhamma, is to be able to know our own mind, to see into our own mind, and to understand our own mind. But this is not always so easy, because the mind has many little, subterfuges, means of deceiving oneself, means of evading the task of looking at oneself and understanding the workings of one's own mind. And yet the Buddha makes this the task since he's speaking to the monks, for a monk, but for anyone who's following his teaching, the task is to know one's own mind. And this has important implications at each stage of the Buddhist training or the Buddhist path. As you may know, if you've been acquainted with the Dhamma for some time, the Buddha often arranges his teaching or the practice of his teaching into 3 stages, which are called the stages of Sila, or moral discipline, good conduct, the stage of Samadhi, concentration or purification of the mind, and the stage of Panya, the stage of wisdom or insight. And so to know one's own mind is important at each of these stages. And this shows that each of these stages, we could say, is a process of ethical purification which progresses from a coarser level to a middling level to a subtler level. And at the end culminates in the final goal of the teaching, which is vimukti, liberation, release from the cycle of birth, old age, and death. Okay, so at the stage of Sila, we can see that knowing one's own mind is extremely essential, because the task of Sila is to regulate our bodily and verbal conduct. And where does bodily and verbal conduct originate from? Bodily conduct doesn't originate from the body. Verbal conduct doesn't originate from speech, from the mouth. But both bodily and verbal conduct originate from the mind. And so we could say that the body is an instrument or a tool for expressing the mind, the thoughts, the intentions through physical action. Speech is an instrument or a means of expressing intentions, thoughts, purposes, goals, emotions, aspirations through the instrumentality of speech in verbal action. And so when we're going to act, in order for our action to fulfill the training in moral discipline, one has to know one's own mind and be able to act on the basis of what we call wholesome states of mind or virtuous states of mind. So there is a sutta where the Buddha is speaking to his son Rahula. And at this time, Rahula is just 8 years old. He's just a newly ordained novice. And so, little boys, even if they're ordained as novice monks, they're still disposed to mischievous behavior. And so it seems the Buddha was being a little harsh on Rahula. Especially in the earlier part of the sutta, he gave him a rather sharp lecture on speaking lies. But the Buddha then continues the discourse and he says, first he asked Rahula, what is the purpose of a mirror? And then Rahula says, the purpose of the mirror is to examine oneself. And so then the Buddha says, in the same way, whenever you are going to perform any action, whether by body, speech, or thought, you should reflect upon your own mind and consider this action that I'm going to perform by body, speech, or mind, is it unwholesome or wholesome? And to determine whether it's unwholesome or wholesome, one has to inquire. The Buddha goes on to explain, one has to inquire, is this action going to lead to the harm for oneself, to the harm of others, or to the harm of both? And it's interesting here that, sometimes we think that the ideal in behavior is always to act just for the good of others. But here the Buddha says that one should consider whether the action is going to lead to harm or good for oneself. And by good for oneself, he's not speaking about, is this action going to make you rich, famous, well-liked, popular, since he's a monk, highly venerated by others, but rather he means, is this action going to lead to your real spiritual well-being, or is it going to lead to your harm? And so the Buddha explains this by way of bodily action, verbal action, and even thoughts. If you're indulging in certain thoughts, are these thoughts leading to my own harm, to the harm of others, to the harm of both? If one knows that's the case, the Buddha says, then you should refrain from that bodily action, from that speech, from those thoughts. But if you know that those actions, bodily actions, speech, thoughts, are going to lead to the good of yourself, the good of others, then you can engage in them. And so we could see that knowing one's own mind already has, we call it the pivotal role in transforming one's sila, one's conduct. So we could see that, people who are, thieves, murderers, habitual liars, or who just impulsively give way to harsh and coarse behavior, the reason why they're engaging in such conduct is because they don't have what I would call a moral check on their mind. Of course, if somebody is going to rob a bank, they know. You ask them, what is your state of mind? Oh, I'm thinking to rob a bank. So you can't say that they don't know their own state of mind, but they're not sort of scanning their mind from the perspective of transforming the mind. Whereas what the Buddha is aiming at is the transformation of the mind. And the transformation of the mind has to begin even at the level of one's outward conduct, whether through body or through speech. So somebody, might be thinking, okay, I'm going to be a great meditator, but, if at work, if nobody is looking, he might be taking, stacks of, we used to call them typing paper, now they call them photocopy paper, maybe putting it into his handbag, or stealing other little things. So if one is behaving in that way, even if you're sitting 3 or 4 hours in meditation a day, but you don't have the foundation, because at the time that you're stealing the goods from the company, then you have unwholesome state of mind. And that is sort of undermining and corrupting one's practice. Okay, so one starts by knowing one's state of mind as a way of regulating sila, or ethical behavior. Then one moves on to the practice of meditation. And so the task, what becomes sort of the task of meditation, at least the first task, is to clearly and directly know one's mind, to be able to continuously know one's state of mind. Because what happens in meditation is we usually start with a very simple object, something which is, let's say, that's plain and unadorned, something like the breath, or the rise and fall of the abdomen, or just sensations in the body. And one's task, the initial task, is just to keep the mind focused on that very simple object, and to be able to sustain the attention on that object. But what happens when one is trying to sustain the attention on an object? What happens? Thoughts come up, exactly. And so what happens now is the attempt to focus the mind on that simple object, is that what is causing those thoughts to come up? What do you think?
The mind does.
Exactly. But some people think, wow, before I started to try to practice meditation, I didn't have so many thoughts. But now, I'm sitting here and I have a very simple task: keep the mind on the breath, keep the mind on the abdomen, keep the mind on the sensations. And what's going on? It's stirring up all of these thoughts. But actually, what's happening all the time in our ordinary life is that those thoughts are running through the mind. But because we don't have a light to shine on the mind, we're not aware of those thoughts. Those thoughts just arise and they control us and govern us, and we act impulsively. We do this, we do that. Just like a puppet that's controlled by the puppet master, who pulls one string and the arm goes up, who pulls another string and the leg comes up. And so these thoughts are constantly controlling us, and just like the puppet isn't aware of the puppet master, we're not aware of these thoughts constantly arising and controlling us. My first Buddhist teacher, when I complained about this to him, I thought the meditation is causing all the thoughts to come up. He used a very insightful or helpful simile. He said that it's like you have a room with all of the shades have been shut, and nobody has been using this room, for months. And then suddenly you come into the room, when you go into the room and there's just the dim light coming through the shades, everything seems in order. But if you come in after a few months and then you open the shades so that the sunlight can come through, you see that there's a lot of specks of dust floating through the air, and a lot of dust has settled on, the tabletops and the bookcases and whatever. Which reminds me, I have to get somebody to clean my bookcases next week. Okay, so this is like what's happening with the meditation when one is trying to settle the mind upon a single object. The mind keeps on deviating from the object. We get lost in what we call distracted thoughts. And these distracted thoughts are the kinds of thoughts which are constantly popping up and just vanishing in our minds. But because in our day-to-day life, especially before we start a practice of meditation, we're not making any attempt to observe the mind, we don't realize these thoughts are coming. And so the first sign of progress in meditation is that one becomes aware of the multiplicity and the diversity of the thoughts that run through the mind. And so this is the importance of knowing the mind, is because it's knowing the mind that helps us move on to the next stage in meditation, which is called shaping the mind. So when one starts to know the mind, then one sees that there are many different thoughts, many different feelings, emotions, plans, fears, worries, concerns that are coming through the mind. But the Buddha gives us a kind of, what makes his teaching so valuable is that he gives us templates for being able to understand these states of mind, so that we don't just become aware of many thoughts arising in the mind, but we can begin to see what is the nature of these thoughts. And especially the major template that the Buddha gives us is the distinction between, again, it's between unwholesome thoughts and wholesome thoughts. And so the unwholesome thoughts are thoughts which are rooted, especially the Buddha says, thoughts that are rooted in greed, aversion, and ignorance or delusion. So those are the three roots of all the unwholesome states of mind. And from those unwholesome roots, there come out many different branches. Restlessness, worry, laziness, anger, envy, jealousy, miserliness, conceit, self-disparagement, competitiveness. I'm sorry, the American Enterprise Institute is not so happy that I'm criticizing competitiveness. Okay, so when we see and understand that these are unwholesome thoughts, then we make the effort to at least to inhibit them and to clear them away. And then at the same time, there come up, sort of swelling up out of the depths of the mind, many wholesome qualities, wholesome states of mind, like faith or confidence, mindfulness, vigor, joy, bliss, loving kindness, compassion, generosity. So when we see these wholesome thoughts, then we can recognize these are good thoughts, thoughts which are to be developed and cultivated and acted upon. So in this way, through the practice of meditation, we come to know the mind and to shape the mind. And even when one is if you're doing a simple practice like mindfulness of breathing, it seems very, very colorless, so you think, what can be so wholesome about just keeping one's attention on the breath? But actually, what one is doing, what is taking place when one is making the effort to keep the attention on the breath, or on any other simple object, is that sort of in the depths of the mind, there is this, what I call a substratum of purity, of bliss, of spiritual beauty, which is usually sort of just hidden and concealed by all of the disturbing and distracting thoughts. The Buddha says that the mind, by its essential nature, is luminous or radiant, but that radiance is covered up by the defilements. So as we're cultivating the mind and just even undertaking the simple task of keeping the mind on the breath, one is pushing away or letting settle the unwholesome thoughts and then creating an opening or a space for that luminosity, that spring or fountain of bliss and joy and radiance to come up to the surface of the mind and to develop a power and a kind of healing effect on the whole mind-body complex. Okay, so this is the benefit of knowing the mind through the second stage of Buddhist practice, which is meditation. Then, as I said, in the third stage of Buddhist practice is wisdom. In this case, to develop wisdom, one has to know what I would call the essential nature of the mind. And this means to know that what we call the mind, normally we call the mind, we begin to see is a stream or process of ever-changing mental events which are always arising and passing away. And so now this is not the kind of constant succession of thoughts that happen when the mind is distracted and disturbed, but rather when the mind is concentrated and focused, then one turns the beam of attention on the mind itself, the body and the mind, and one sees that the body is a stream or current of physical processes always arising and passing away, and the mind is also a current or stream of mental processes which are always arising and passing away. So that takes us into what is called the characteristic or mark of anicca, impermanence, that the mind, by its very essential nature, has no substantiality, no permanence, that it's always one occasion of mind arises, remains momentarily, passes away. Another moment of mind arises, stays momentarily, passes away. Another moment arises and passes away. And so one starts to see now into the mind-body process that everything in this process is impermanent, subject to constant change, perishing, breaking up, and vanishing. And with the insight into impermanence, then one sees what I would call the core or essential teaching of the Buddha, that nothing within this complex of body and mind can be taken as a self, as an I, a truly existing core of identity. That what we call I, me, myself is just a convenient designation for an ever-changing process. And so this is the sort of the arising of wisdom, the insight into the impermanent and selfless nature of the body and the mind. And it's when this insight into impermanence and insubstantiality and selflessness is carried to its full conclusion, then there comes the ultimate goal of the Buddha's teaching, which is the akupa cheto vimutti, which is the unshakable liberation of the mind. But even the one who reaches that unshakable liberation of mind, the arahat, also reflects back and knows his state of mind. He knows, now my mind is liberated and it can never again be defiled. Okay, maybe this will do as a sort of short discourse just to open up the floor for discussion and questions. And if some of the people who are sitting in the back, if you want to come closer, especially if you have some questions, then it's easier for me to see. Yeah, so please feel welcome to ask any questions.
Bodhi, you mentioned faith and Buddhism.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I use the word faith as an English rendering of the Pali word saddha. And sometimes the word faith, especially for people who have been brought up in a Christian background, brings up some negative vibrations. But in Buddhism, faith doesn't mean like the compulsion to believe in certain doctrines which are laid down categorically. You have to believe this. That is the test of your faith. But rather what I call faith means a deep confidence and trust in the Buddha as being a fully enlightened teacher, and in the Dharma, the teaching, as being the disclosure of the actual nature of things and the path to liberation. Now, some people render saddha as confidence, but to me confidence is a much weaker word, whereas saddha involves what I call a strong personal commitment that follows upon this trust. So through saddha, one has trust in that one accepts the Buddha as one's teacher, and one accepts his teaching as one's guide through life, and then one makes a personal commitment to follow that teaching, even though one doesn't know for oneself the truth of everything the Buddha teaches, because there are many things that at present lie beyond our own capacity for verification. And even though one hasn't, even though one is not able to know everything that the Buddha teaches, and even though one might just be taking baby steps in the teaching, but still one is ready to make that commitment to follow the Dhamma. And that's what I mean by saddha, or faith. Oh, please. Yeah, what is your name?
Matthew,
Matthew, okay.
thank you very much for being here tonight. I was just thinking it's almost like a college course you just taught in 15 minutes. I was wondering if we would have any homework, first of all.
Yeah, you can send it to me, then I'll grade you. Please.
Part of bringing the meditation practice to the mind-body,
Yeah.
which I've heard many, many times, and have, I guess, tried to do, which you explained very simply and beautifully tonight. While I'm sitting in meditation, then part of my meditation could be actually observing the thoughts and just being wholesome and realizing I'm wholesome.
Actually, that is a good question. Generally, I don't suggest this for people who are just beginning or at the beginning of a meditation session. But what I found for myself to be a useful practice is partway through the sitting, after getting a certain stabilization of the mind, using the primary meditation object to settle the mind and let a lot of the distractions sort of bubble up and then pass away. Then just to turn the mind then to the mind itself. And what I use as a kind of anchor for the attention is the word mind. So just using the word but not reciting it like a mantra or a mechanical formula, mind, 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 not like that, but just as a kind of homing device. So just to observe the mind and just note whatever thoughts arise and let them pass away. And if the mind gets distracted, then one notes, distraction, distracted thoughts, and then let the distracted thought go, and then bring the mind back to itself with the focusing device, mind, mind. And then sometimes if certain disturbing thoughts become, or even streams of many different distracting thoughts become overwhelming, so that one can't get any traction at all on the primary object, then, this is something to experiment with. Just letting go of the primary object for the time being and just observing the mind, whatever state of mind has arisen, just observe it. Even if the mind, sometimes if it's overcome by anger about something one is remembering, you could just focus in on that state of anger. Or if it's overcome by fear about something, just observing fear. And what's interesting to note is that when one focuses in on a particular mind state, paying close attention to it, that mind state, that disturbing or distracting mind state starts to fade out, and it loses its power until it fades out. And I compare this to, I use a simile of, in the shop, when you go into a store to buy something, there are these mirrors in the corners, or maybe now that even they don't have to use the mirrors, they have the surveillance camera going. So if the thief comes into the shop and is the expression he cases the joint? Sam is more familiar with these things than I am. Does case the joint mean you look the place up in order to see whether you... So he looks over and he sees the surveillance cameras, then he'll think, this isn't a good place for shoplifting, and he'll go someplace else. So this is, whether it's the mirror or the surveillance camera, that is like observing one's own mind, and the disturbing thought, anger, fear, craving, worry, whatever it is, that is like the thief that's come into the shop. So as long as you're watching the mind, when those disturbing thoughts come up, then you just focus the attention on them, just like the camera is on that customer who's a suspicious customer who's come in. And then those thoughts can't dominate the mind, but they remain, or maybe for a little while, then they think, there's no room for us here, and then they'll drop away. Yes, please.
Hello, Bhante. I have a question about the sutta you mentioned about the Rahuva.
Yeah.
The third part of when the Buddha says you should reflect before an action by body, speech, and mind.
Yeah.
I sometimes get a little confused about that third part, reflecting before an act of mind, because all the thoughts seem to just sort of happen by themselves rather than...
Yeah. I think this is probably not referring to those spontaneous thoughts that arise, but if one is sort of engaging in a course of reflection, entertaining what we call a particular course of thoughts. Do you get the point there?
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh. Okay, so let's say a young monk, not as young as 8, but 18, 19, is engaging in lustful thoughts. So then, because he'll be aware that I see, before he engages in that. Yeah, I have to say in that case, I wouldn't take it then too literally, because this is a case where the sutta is using a kind of formula for each type of action. And so just to maintain the consistency of the formula, it's applied to bodily, verbal, and mental action. But in the case of mental action, it works somewhat differently.
But someone just starting out in meditation, and even though you said as we're starting out,
Yeah.
We shouldn't be reflecting and things like that, but when you're starting out meditating, and you're seeing these unwholesome states arise,
Yeah.
would you say that could be discouraging to a new meditator? To say, well, oh my goodness, look what's going on up there.
That can be discouraging. But that's why, one has to encourage somebody who's a new meditator by pointing out that these thoughts that are arising are just that they're not being stirred up by the meditation, but you're just becoming aware of the thoughts that are, often passing through your mind, but you just haven't been aware of them before. And that's a sign of progress. And just, he should consider that, in time, beneficial, one will start to experience the benefit of the practice. Just the fact that one could recognize these thoughts and make the effort to put them aside and then to develop good thoughts. And then there are many other, the Buddha doesn't just teach mindfulness of breathing as a way of training the mind, but there are many discourses which deal with other methods of mind training. So like one of the methods is when you recognize a particular unwholesome thought, then you cultivate the mind state that's directly opposed to that unwholesome thought. So somebody, say, is constantly plagued by angry thoughts. In that case, one instructs this person that you should develop thoughts of loving kindness.
And I was a little bit unclear on the natural state of the mind is silent and illuminated. So once the mind is silent, are you suggesting to provoke it as far as thoughts go, just so you can watch thoughts?
Say again?
When we sit and we calm the mind, the natural state of the mind is silent and illuminated. It's quiet, it's calm. And so halfway through you said to start to watch your thoughts. But if the mind is silent, do you?
No, I'm not saying in that case that you should watch your thoughts. I'm just speaking in general about somebody who's practicing, that this is a useful method. It can be a useful method once the mind gets a certain degree of stability, it's a useful method to keep the mind sort of focused on the mind itself in order to see at what I would say subtler levels what kind of events are taking place in the mind. Because as one just goes on focusing on the mind, one starts to see events happening in the mind at subtler and subtler levels and happening more and more quickly, so to speak. So one can start to see thoughts even before they really form as thoughts, until they become just like almost formless bubbles coming up, almost like bubbled impulses towards thoughts. But because the mind is being watched, they don't really get a chance to form into thoughts, unless one loses that or strays from the post of observation. And when one strays from the post of observation, then those impulses turn into thoughts.
I like the example that you have mentioned about when you go through meditation, you get lots of thoughts floating in your head, and it's almost equivalent to when you go to a dark room and then you see everything looks okay, but when you open the windows, you see a lot of dust particles and all the floating around.
Yeah.
So when you get deep into good meditation practice, would you say that you're quote unquote clearing the air, so to speak? All of these dust particles somehow get blown away or something like that? Would that be a good example?
Yeah, I think that's a good example, yeah. But there's always like problems with similes. If you try to carry them through too far, sometimes one gets into little problems with them. Because when dust settles in the room, clearing the air is better than settling the dust, because when the dust settles, it's still in the room. Yes, yeah, please.
The other day I was sitting down in meditation and I was just restless. So I just said, okay, I'm just going to accept the fact that I'm restless. And I watched it.
Yeah.
That's a good thing, right? A good practice?
Yeah, that's a good way, yeah. In fact, if you look in what's called the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha's discourse on the four foundations of mindfulness, in the fourth section of that, what's called the contemplation of dhammas, a very broad word, maybe taking qualities. The first subsection in that is contemplation of the five hindrances. So practicing the foundations of mindfulness doesn't mean that you sit down and immediately all of the problems are gone, but sort of the first stage here is when a thought of sensual desire arises, one knows there is sensual desire in me. When a thought of anger arises, one knows there's a thought of anger in me. When the mind becomes dull and drowsy, one knows dullness and drowsiness. When the mind is restless, one knows restlessness. When the mind is troubled by doubt, one is aware of the doubt. So just being able to note these states of mind, to observe them, is itself part of the practice.
Bhante, can you talk a little bit about how to combat or counter restlessness and those things in your meditation?
Sort of according to the commentaries, the way that the commentary, or even the sutta, I think this even goes back to the sutta, what it offers as the antidote to restlessness is mindfulness of breathing, which sometimes makes me go, that's what I've been doing. So experimenting, I found some other methods that work for dealing with restlessness. Sometimes, I betray myself. I'm not the perfect, meditator. So sometimes the mind gets this goes back, years ago, so restless that I can't even sit to meditate. So what I would do is to do walking meditation. So when you're doing the walking meditation, just being attentive, and if the mind is restless, not trying to do the very slow walking meditation of lifting the foot, bringing it forward, putting it down, pressing it against the ground, because the mind is not yet ready for that degree of subtle practice. But just doing walking at a moderate pace, about 20 or 30 yards, just doing right step, left step, left step to the end, and turning around, then coming back, right, left, because one is doing something which is active. On the one hand, it's channeling the energy of the restless mind. Yet on the other hand, because it's a practice which is done with mindfulness, one is still meditating despite the restlessness of the mind. So that is one type of practice that I've used to deal with restlessness. Another kind of practice is, instead of trying to focus on something as precise as in and out breathing, instead to let the attention go through the whole body and just be aware of the whole body in the sitting posture. So this corresponds to the instruction in the Satipatthana Sutta. When one is sitting, one knows one is sitting. Yes, Heidi? Excuse me?
Some people do meditation,
Yeah.
visualization, meditation,
Yeah.
and by thinking about Buddha or
Yeah.
Bodhisattva or
Yeah. Yeah.
even the Catholics, they think about the
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Is that considered real meditation, or is that really bring the mind, into the state of calmness?
I didn't get the last phrase. Is it bringing the mind to calmness?
Yes.
Yeah, one can use a visualization. I mean, like one of the techniques or one of the meditation objects taught is called Buddhanusati, which is recollection of the Buddha. And the way it's taught in the suttas, it's sort of the emphasis is on the qualities of the Buddha rather than on visualization. But in the, what I call the practice tradition, the way I learned in Sri Lanka, in order to be able to bring to mind the qualities of the Buddha, one visualizes an image of the Buddha, a particular image that one finds uplifting and inspiring. And one shouldn't make it too complicated, like trying to visualize, or at least in my experience, trying to visualize all of the details. I know that the Tibetans do very complex visualizations, and maybe they have the skills for that. I don't have those skills. But I would just take like a simple image of the Buddha and just bring that to mind. And it has many benefits because it inspires one, particularly if one already has saddha or faith in the Buddha. And it's uplifting and inspiring and calming. And so it's a perfectly legitimate object of meditation.
Is that original meditation taught in the ancient times?
The recollection of the Buddha?
Yes.
Yeah, one finds it mentioned in the suttas, yeah. In fact, there's a set of 6 meditations, which are called the 6 anusati, the 6 recollections. So this is the recollection of the Buddha, recollection of the Dhamma, which is, I think, more complicated or more difficult, recollection of the Sangha, then there's recollection of generosity, of sila or good behavior, and then the 6th is recollection of the deities, which is not like a worship of the deities, but it's recollecting the merits by which the deities those beings got to be reborn as deities, and then considering that one has these same qualities in oneself. Yeah, please feel welcome to ask again. What is your name again?
Rick.
Rick, that's right, yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Great to see you. Talk a little bit about using the mind in meditation to heal the body.
I'm not sure that I would say that one could use the mind in meditation to heal the body. Maybe there are some, I've read of cases of people who, through deep meditation, have healed heal themselves of debilitating illnesses, but I don't know that this is a kind of regular practice that one can do. And often it's not that the person deliberately used the mind to heal the body, it's just that they went deeply into meditation and then they found that their illness had just gone into remission by itself. This has happened, at least the way I've heard it, particularly with cancer cases. But it's not that they were deliberately using the mind to heal the body. And I don't know whether that will always be successful.
Well, when you do a body scan,
Yeah.
isn't it possible to sort of focus on one particular part and just leave the mind there and sort of soothe, if not heal?
One can do that, whether it's going to heal a particular malady of that organ or part of the body, that I don't know. Perhaps in some cases it will. Maybe that's the way it's happened in the cases of these spontaneous, where this spontaneous remission has taken place. But in the cases I heard, the person wasn't deliberately trying to cure themselves, but it just happened in the course of their meditation. Yes, please.
The Buddha spoke about, when they would chant the 7 factors of
Oh,
life.
actually, that's right. Yeah. That's the. Just when you raised your hand, suddenly I thought of that even before you said it. I wasn't. It just occurred to me that there are some suttas, and especially this is the 7 factors of enlightenment. There's a sutta where Mahakassapa gets ill, and the Buddha comes to him and recites the 7 factors of enlightenment, and Mahakassapa is listening, and while he's listening, then he recovers from his illness. Another time, I think it's Mahamoggallana gets ill, and the Buddha comes and recites, and Moggallana recovers. Then, on another occasion, the Buddha himself is ill, and then he calls another monk to come and recite the 7 factors, and then the Buddha recovers. But this, I think I've recited the 7 factors for a few sick people. They didn't recover. Yeah. And I think some recited for me, and I didn't recover. So it's not like this is like the Buddha reciting and Mahachunda reciting. So these were like maybe using the full power of their mind. Excuse me? It's actually done it's a very common practice in Sri Lanka. When somebody is seriously ill, they'll call monks, and then they'll recite the sutta on the 7 Bojjhangas. Yeah, please.
I think maybe there's a different relationship, for example, with pain, that one can have through meditation.
Yeah.
So if you're not there's no aversion to the pain.
Yeah.
Or just sitting with the pain.
Yeah.
That there's a different relation.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually. Well, that might be one factor that brings about the spontaneous healing effect, is that instead of, usually when we get ill with severe painful feelings, then we become sort of overwhelmed by aversion towards the pain and moods of dejection and just a wish that the pain will go away and fear that the pain is going to get worse. And so one of the sort of approaches in meditation is, instead of like turning away from the pain in that way, but just to observe the pain and just treat it as an experience of sensations, They're sensations which have a particular quality to them that makes them painful, but when one looks at them very deeply and consistently, one sees that, again, that they're just a series or stream of occasions of sensation arising and passing away. And so this can make the pain actually very, very interesting and even very powerful as a meditation object. And so that might have a healing effect. But even if it doesn't bring about a healing of illness, but it turns painful feelings into an object of meditation. And this, you don't have to wait till you get painful feelings through some illness, but when one is sitting in meditation, in fact, this is the advice we usually give, when one starts to get pains in the legs and the knees, don't immediately start changing the position, but just observe those sensations. If the pain becomes so strong that you can't focus on the primary object, the breath or whatever it is, then just let go of the primary object and just observe those painful sensations. And so as one is observing the pain, whether in the legs, the knees, the buttocks, one starts to see just pains arising and passing away. And then it becomes, one advantage is that it becomes a very interesting object of meditation. A second advantage is that one is no longer turning away from the pain with those emotions from the pain with those feelings of fear and aversion towards them. And the third advantage is that as you become able to tolerate the painful sensations, then one develops the ability to sit longer, because the legs become more accustomed to sitting cross-legged. Yes, please.
How can we cultivate loving kindness through meditation?
That is actually a topic it requires a separate explanation. There's a systematic practice of loving kindness meditation. And I think, I'd have to give almost like a separate discourse on the development of loving kindness meditation. But maybe one of the monks will give it on a Wednesday.
Would it be possible to recommend a sutta for us
For the loving kindness meditation. The thing is that the suttas don't explain the loving kindness meditation very systematically. One finds it sort of the basis for the way it's taught within the Theravada tradition. The basis is in the Visuddhimagga, which is somewhat difficult to read because it's written in a very scholastic style. But I think that there are probably books available that give instruction in the loving kindness meditation.
And we have a little booklet called Love and Compassion.
Is that still available? Is it on, do we have it on the BGR website? It's there.
I don't know if it is there, but I do have it. If anyone is interested, I can give it back to them.
Excuse me?
I have the file.
You have the file? Okay, then
I also have the book. The real book.
you have the actual printed book.
Yeah, we have that. I'm not,
But if you want to learn the loving kindness meditation at Dwangyen Monastery over the Thanksgiving vacation, the monk Venerable Dhammadipa, he's going to give, I think it's a 5-day retreat on the loving kindness meditation. So then you'll get, excuse me? Oh, yeah, this is the monastery where I live in upstate New York. there'll be a loving kindness meditation retreat, or actually the 4 sublime states: loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity, for 5 days. So if you go to the website of the Buddhist Association of the United States, and then you go down the home page, then you'll see it listed there. And it's good to learn to do it in a retreat situation like that, because then you have to do it all day, pretty much all day, several days in succession. It was like reading some instruction and then practicing just on your own. It's rather difficult. Okay, so maybe if there's no more questions, then maybe we will wind up for the evening. Do you have some like closing? Excuse me? Oh, okay. Bhavatu Sabla Mangala.
And different Dhamma. And I would like to thank again Venerable Bodhi. And I think 5 or 6 days ago I received an email from Bhante mentioning about his visit to the temple. And I asked him, we have a meditation group, a small group, and if you have time, please give Dhamma talk and participate Dhamma discussion. And by accepting, he did it, and also I am thanked again on behalf of our Nayak Hamza and all the other members. May you be well and happy, and thank you very much. And please, we are going to bless you by chanting.
Okay. Maybe in 2 months, maybe I'll come again.
Again?
In 2 months, yeah. Maybe say November. Because October I'll be in the West Coast.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think within another 2 months, we can meet him. And I will inform you. And we will display using our website, temple website. And thank you.
Sabba Mangalang Kantu Sabba Devata Buddhanubhavena Sada Soti Vantu Te Bhavatu Sabba Mangalang Rakantu Sabba Devata Sabba Dhammanubhavena Sada Soti Vantu Te Bhavatu Sabba Mangalang Rakantu Sabba Devata Sabba Sanghanubhavena Sada Soti Bhavantu Te.
May you be well and happy. May you be free from suffering. May you have courage, patience, understanding, and determination to overcome failures in your life. May we all attain ultimate peace. Sadhu, sadhu.